Welcome everybody to our second panel on teaching with, featuring some star teachers to, talk about their experiences. This one, first of all, I want to tell, my name is Tunay Tunca. I'm the chair of the Teaching Enhancement Committee this year, and this panel is organized jointly between the TEC and the OTL. So I'd like to thank Diren and Candice, all our OTL partners, Dan as well as what I'm going to do, I'm just going to give very quick introduction. Of course, it won't do justice to our 3-star panelists today. In alphabetical order. So our first panelist is Cecilia Bustamante from finance. She's a past Crow Award winner. I've served in some committee with her as well. She teaches several courses, including a course on valuation, right? Corporate valuation. And a recent course I saw on IO and financial economics, right? Which if I were a student, I would want to take that. So it sounds very interesting. And our second panelist is Zilong Chan from the OIT department. And Zilong is an excellent teacher, again, a past Crow winner, all our panelists are. And he teaches some great courses in operations management and supply chain. And third panelist, last but not least, is Rochelle Sampson from LBPP. And she's especially well known for her teaching the core economics classes in the MBA programs. One thing I want to say is that, again, this is the second of our panels, and then this one focuses on quantitative teaching. So all 3 panel speakers today teach quantitative courses and have extensive experience on that. So with that short introduction, I'll just pass it to Diren, who will manage the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Tunay. I think that Tunay is right. There's really no way to do justice to all of the people that are on our panel. But really, I think the main reason that I'm excited that you're all here is that I know that instruction is part of your passion as well as your content area. And that you all have research demands and teaching demands that you balance, and you still manage to keep the students at the center of sort of what you're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to achieve, which I think is quite remarkable given the other demands on your time. So my first question, we are going to go alphabetically. Thank you, Tunay. So Cecilia, I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit on sort of, it's a full year now that we've been doing pandemic teaching. What's something that you learned from it, and how might you apply it when we go back to in-person this coming fall?
What I learned is that actually online teaching teaches that, online and in person need not be necessarily mutually exclusive. And so for instance, like in some courses, I'm teaching cases, and I think people find it very useful to actually go back to the video and see you explain it again. So tape recording is useful, but also you can give material in videos, even if you're meeting people in person. So I'm actually considering doing that in the future so that, in the same way that people listen to podcasts these days and they find it better than reading a book. I'm an older generation, so I like books a lot, but that's a different story. I think these materials can complement each other. The other experience that I had with my evaluation course in the full-time MBA is that I was worried about interaction and people getting, tired. And I was surprised, which is the reason why I love teaching that course, is the level of engagement of my students, and everyone was extremely committed. And I honestly felt no difference. The only difference is that I would have liked to see them and interact with them, but it was probably harder for them. But I also felt that this was probably mystified more than it actually is. At least this has been my experience, because I think our students are remarkable people.
So I deeply admire what you shared, Cecilia. And one thing I would note is that I don't think it's an accident that your engagement was very high. I think that's partly because of the way that you're teaching and the way that you try and get your students engaged both in the discussion of your topic and the application.
Well, thank you. But, they have a lot of merit, I think.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about one of the bigger challenges of teaching a quant course throughout the pandemic, or moving a quant course online.
I think in general, what happens with quant courses, like regardless of the pandemic, is that people sometimes feel intimidated, like depending on the background. Like this is what I feel like some courses that people have different heterogeneous backgrounds. And I think that's a challenge. And the way I usually deal with that is telling people that they can show up at my office, that there is no such thing as a silly question, so that they get confident that they can do this. And they get, evaluation is not that hard, for instance, on other courses that I'm teaching for that matter. But I think that's harder when you're teaching online, reaching out, because you can do it on Zoom, but I have the impression that people would not necessarily feel so confident that just like reaching out, dropping a question and a break, or so that's probably the difference. Although what I was telling you is I didn't feel it was such a big difference in the courses that I've been teaching. But I think what you have to do when you're teaching a quantitative course is being very clear, having very good slides. That anyway, this is something that you have to do anyway when you do online teaching, having very good material, but also being available to kind of accommodate for the different backgrounds of people. So that's the way, in general, what I was saying is that sometimes maybe online this is a bit harder.
I absolutely agree. I think being available even for a faculty member is a little bit harder, because the pandemic was so taxing and people's time was limited. And so trying to be as compassionate as you could and making yourself available had to be a lot more deliberate, because like you said, there wasn't just a natural pause of, oh, it's a 15-minute break and they can kind of walk up and talk to you. So I think it's wonderful you made space for that. So Rochelle, I'm gonna call on you next. I'm going first name alphabetical. So the same question, as you reflect on sort of one full year of pandemic teaching behind us, what's something that you learned from it, and how might you apply it to your in-person instruction?
Thank you. So there's a number of things that I learned, but I was primarily somebody who used the boards in my classroom for the quant class. And so while there are ways of doing that online, and I still did to some extent, I had to make the transition to using a lot of slides. And then furthermore, I found that I could just cover less material in the live session than I would in an in-person session. And so that led to a choice of either do I cut material or do I develop more asynchronous content? And I chose the latter. But it had an unexpected benefit. So, I developed these asynchronous sort of teaching materials, namely videos, in which I would have like a short presentation and I'd embed problems in it, where I do them on like a virtual whiteboard. And then when I uploaded them into Panopto, I would embed a quiz in them. And the students universally loved it. And so what happened is that we all talk about kind of flipping our classrooms and moving, all of the non-engaging material, the more lecture-y stuff kind of outside of the live session, even for in-person, right? Students read their books or do their case reading or whatever it is, or prepare for class. And the idea is in person is supposed to be more engaging. And this forced that even more, right? To just kind of push everything out of the classroom that wasn't really interactive into this asynchronous format. And the students came to me and said, they thanked me for having these problems. They appreciated the chance to go back and review the steps kind of over and over again. And then what happened was I could do more difficult problems in the class. So I was actually finding that my online students were better prepared for the live sessions than my in-person students were, because I had done these asynchronous materials. And so now I'm going to use them this fall, even though we're planning on being in person, which is awesome. And now I have this material that I don't have to redevelop, obviously, which is nice. And then the other thing that I learned with pandemic teaching, which I don't think is unique to quant teaching, is that a little compassion goes a long way. That it's not a slippery slope, that it's not, a constant request for more and more leniency by just listening to students. Like sometimes, they don't even need action. They just need to be heard in their struggles. And just doing that and saying, you know, what is it that you need? And, you know, what kind of support do you need in this? Usually goes a very long way towards solving whatever problems may be arising for the students in the moment. So I think the big thing for me is flipping the classroom even more. So live sessions are truly interactive. And then the development of all of this asynchronous material, which allows review of technical problems and allows the students to be better prepared for the in-class live sessions.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Rochelle. And I actually think you've hit on something that's sort of a wonderful combination for teaching, which is a highly interactive session. So you have high expectations of hearing from the students, coupled with compassion. And I think sometimes, like you said, people feel if they're more compassionate, they're reducing their expectations somehow on the students. And I have found the reverse is almost always true. Because if you have exceedingly high expectations, which most faculty do and should have, and you're compassionate, it sort of says to the students, hey, I really expect you to be successful here, and I'm going to help you do that. And I'm going to help you get to that piece of that moment of success, right, as a student. And I think it's wonderful that you did that. And I love that you talked about reusing your asynchronous content. I think sometimes as faculty, we wish we could be in multiple places at once, and somehow asynchronous content sort of facilitates that for us, right? Where you know you've taught it the same way, the same time, even if you change your words, but having it actually recorded just means the student get to visit with your wisdom at a pace that might work better for them in some cases. So I think that that's a wonderful share out, and I'm grateful. So Zhilong, and I noticed that Tunai introduced you as Zilong. So let me make sure I say it right. How would you like?
Yeah, it is Zilong. Yes.
Zilong. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So Zilong, same question for you. Reflecting on one full year of pandemic teaching, what have you learned from it, and what might you bring with you to your in-person instruction?
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so I found a few things that I have been doing, in the last 12 months or so, are very helpful. I think, I will probably continue doing this even if I go back to, a normal in-person teaching. For example, holding office hours online, right? I'm sure, everybody now has to hold the office hour online. But in fact, I find it's very convenient, right? Not only, for myself, but also for students, obviously. I think particularly, if you're teaching part-time MBA students, right? The evening students, they have a job during the daytime, and then in the evening, they come to your class. Now, if you arrange on-site office hours, then, they have to find extra time, right? Additional time to come to your office hours. So that can be very difficult. I think holding online office hours, certainly I feel that's probably one of the best things that we can use in terms of Zoom, right? And then, some other things we can do. For example, I now assign online quizzes, right? So, in the past, usually I don't do that, but now, in order for students to say understand some things better, you can assign a shorter quiz, right? So they do a shorter quiz and some multiple choice questions, right? So for example, you have a case assignment you want to discuss in the class, and you want to make sure that everybody reads it. So how do you do it? Well, you assign an online quiz, so they have to read it, right? With a few points, but they have to read it. They have to pass the online quiz. So that is, I think, one of the ways you can engage the students, and without really, kind of requiring them to spend too much time, right? But at least, they can be better prepared for class discussion. Okay. And then also, obviously, being online, they have to submit the homeworks online. Right. So I find this is also very useful. In the past, usually I collect their hard copies, right, in the classroom, and then you have to find a way to give the hard copies to the TA, right? So, and then that can be a delay of a few days, right? Particularly, I think if you are teaching 7-week course, right? In the MBA program, you have to grade the homework within a week, right? You have to return next week. So I think by submitting online, and then the TA, right, also is very convenient. Then the TA can grade it and leave the comments there. So I find that now the technology features are really great. You can actually give comments. You can highlight things. You can mark things on students' work, right, where they did wrong, where they got points off. So it's very easy to do. With the Canvas course website, right? The what is called a speed grade, the things there, it's very easy to use, right? And I think another thing I found, probably I will keep doing it, is right now I'm finding, particularly if you are teaching a large class, right? In the beginning, it's always, right? I'm sure you're experiencing this, other faculty must have been experiencing this too. Students will come late. Right, they always, you find always there are a few students, they just come late, like 2 minutes late or 3 minutes late. And then you are kind of watching them, right? You feel like, wow, what should I do, right? So then I figured out a way, I kind of engage, talking to them a little bit, right? The students there, and you ask, you say, okay, do you have any questions, right, about the homework or anything? Or even, you can talk about the weather, right? Talk about the vaccine, right? So kind of engage them a little bit in the beginning while you're waiting for other students to join, right? So I think that's something I will probably will do if I go back to a regular in-person class, right? When students are late, and don't just stand there, right? Don't just wait there. You talk to them a little bit, engage them a little bit. Ask if they have questions. And, particularly if there's homework, due very soon, then obviously they have questions, right? So I think these are the things that I will probably, in fact, I should say I will very likely actually keep doing this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Zhilang. So what I particularly like about what you highlighted was that there's efficiencies, right? If we don't have to rely on the tech, but there are some things that tech just makes significantly easier. For example, you mentioned SpeedGrader and having a couple of multiple choice questions in a quiz that just say, please check in with this reading, make sure you touch on it. And like you said, it doesn't even have to be worth that many points, but it gives them a moment to check in with it that's low stakes and that you don't have to grade, right? And I know you and I have talked about this before, that feedback is very important in your class. And I think that it's especially easy to make your feedback even more meaningful and supportive if some of that basic grading is taken care of. Or like you said, if you can leverage your TA for some of the lower stake assignments, and that you can go in and give comment-based feedback without any of that time lag of putting pen to paper. So Cecilia, I'm coming back around to you. So what I'd love is if you could share how long you've been teaching, not just at Smith, but teaching in general, and then share sort of a challenge that you've experienced as a teacher and how you overcame it, and also a win that you had as an educator where you felt like you were making an impact.
Well, I started teaching when I was a PhD student, because that's the way, like when you're in a PhD, I was at the TA for senior professors, but teaching, basically teaching as a professor myself since 2010. So it's been a while. And so in terms of challenges and wins that you're mentioning, so I guess the big challenge that I had was precisely, so my first experience teaching as a professor was in London. And my background myself, I'm from Argentina, but our education system is not very different from the European style, actually. Which means that, I was not aware about this, but culturally speaking, between where I grew up and then when I did, my graduate studies, and then I ended up working, there was not such a cultural gap when the way you address students, the way things work. And basically, it's I wouldn't say that there is necessarily a distance, but there. It's another way of relating to your professors. I am actually quite a spontaneous person, and I like people to think of me as approachable, so that they can come and they can ask questions. That there is no such thing as a silly question. But however, I was used to the fact that you put out there like a model, you're teaching quantitative stuff, you derive a whole thing, and people are going to go home and basically go over it again if they didn't understand, and then come back to you. But I was thinking, in a way, in my culture, like there is some sort of effort that is implied and this is something very cultural. So I was teaching not very different courses, but to a different audience in London than when I moved here to Maryland. And actually, the first 2 years actually teaching, I did miserably. Like people I don't think were enjoying the way I was teaching. I also didn't know their background so well, so it took me some time to understand exactly what is it that they knew and what they didn't. I mean, I was not teaching them, for instance, their first course in finance, but their second and the third. So the very beginning, my teaching method was not good. I mean, people. I don't think people were enjoying the way I was teaching, and then little by little, I adapted. I learned. I basically made people understand that they could reach me anytime. I changed also not necessarily the content, but the way in which I was teaching things. And then one day, I got the teaching award that I was really not expecting, especially at the beginning of that experience. So I also learned a lot when I moved to the US, and I think it was strictly cultural. So.
No, absolutely. I think most people here know I'm also from Ireland, so I understand that big differences in how things are done in Europe versus here. And even for me as a student, it took me quite a long time to navigate those differences and sort of being very prepared for formality, when informality is a bit more natural for teaching here. And so but I love that you shared that. I think sometimes we focus on sort of everything that we succeed at and everything that we win. And there's a lot of new faculty that don't begin, being sort of aces at instruction, because you get your PhD and you're an expert and you defend, and you don't necessarily get a teaching course in the middle of that. You have to just go in and be in the room. And so I think it's very important that you shared that. And it's sort of a win in the end, because you've come full circle to be an award-winning instructor at Smith now. So thank you very much. Did you want to share a win, or was that also kind of your win?
I mean, that was definitely a win. I think in general, I feel very happy when, people think that my course is useful but painful, and that I make them work a lot, and they tell me this. But I make them understand that I'm also working a lot with them, which is true. But then it's very nice when 1 year after that, with the internships or whatever, they tell me, this was so useful. I was happy, or for instance, I had, after the online course this year, that, it's also hard to understand how people, that's something that, this separation, it's just hard to understand whether people are following, whether they're happy or not. I mean, I was keep asking, but then there was this girl that actually she did very well in the exam. And then she told me, I'm trying to apply this to actually apply it to the basically the company of my husband. And so she started making me even more advanced questions. And that's a win for me. Like when people use what we learn in class and they find it useful.
Absolutely. That's sort of the sweet spot, right? When you find out afterwards. I think the wins don't always come in the classroom. Sometimes they come after, when you see that development in your students and they go on to do great things that make you proud. So I love that you shared that. Rochelle, so same question for you. Tell us a little bit how long you've been teaching at Smith, or how long you've been teaching in general, whatever you prefer. And then a teaching challenge that you've had and how you overcame it, and a teaching win that you've experienced.
Sure. So it's always a little difficult these days to talk about how long I've been teaching. I guess it reveals too much about my age. So I've been at Smith for about 17 years, but I was at NYU for 5 before that as faculty. And then I was teaching as a graduate student as well. So it's been a while. But in terms of challenges, I mean, there have been so many, but I think that one that I think is coming up more recently is having difficult conversations with students. Sometimes this happens in class, and sometimes it happens out of class. And so one example in class is, I teach a quant class, but, context, as we all know, is so important for bringing the content alive. As to why do we care about this, right? And so, through talking about agency problems and moral hazard issues, we talked about the financial crisis and all of the mortgage and lending problems that helped precipitate that crisis. And a feisty debate started in class about the issue of redlining, which is a discriminatory mortgage lending practice that particularly affected minority groups, specifically Black Americans in particular. And one student had brought up this practice and the predatory mortgage lending practices. And then another student countered with, oh, but, what about risk and taking risk into account? And isn't that really what it's about? And aren't we allowed to do that as financiers? And so it could have easily blown up into a very difficult conversation. And I think that we have a tendency, I guess I should speak for myself, there's a tendency to avoid difficult conversations because they're uncomfortable. We don't know how they're going to go or end up. But I think that there's a value to demonstrating to our students the value of staying at the table when things get difficult, setting a tight container for respectful boundaries. Fortunately, we had a pretty strong culture in the classroom of respecting each other. And, my job as moderator is to kind of rein things in a little bit if they're starting to go too far in one direction, or I'm hearing some tone that is going to set things off. But just so what I learned from that is just the ability to kind of hold the space for that discussion and to allow it to progress. Because I think that those sorts of conversations bring the context so alive and make it so memorable for the students, even if it isn't specifically about the moral hazard problem or agency problems that we were, discussing for that class. And then in personal situations, where students are struggling with the material, it is a quant class. And so some students have less background and really wrestle with it more, is how to have honest conversations with them about it while also respecting their strengths and, impressing upon them that this is not a moral failing, that this doesn't say anything about what they're learning or how much they're learning, and really trying to help them make that distinction between grading and learning, and thinking about, the question I usually ask my students is like, look, 5 years from now, what are you going to remember about this class? I'm pretty sure it's not going to be your grade, that you got in this quiz or whatever it is. And so I care about what you learned. And so that changes the complete tone of the conversation. In terms of wins, it's always when students come back and tell you how something impacted them, after they've finished the class or they graduated or they nailed an interview. I had a recent success with an online student who basically got a job from a project that he did in the course, and so he was super excited about it. And others who came back and said, I did great in an interview because of this discussion we had in class. And so they had asked me a question about mergers and acquisitions, and I could bring up all the stuff about integration. And so I got the internship. And so those are the big wins for me, in addition to students actually wanting to stay in touch long after they graduate.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. There's so much that you shared that I want to spotlight, but I'm just excited that we have it recorded. Also, but I think you brought up something that's really important, which is the good student, bad learner paradigm, right? Where we really have the opportunity as instructors to say, think about what you're going to learn from this class, right? You are not actually the sum of this letter grade that's going to be provided to you. It's really about what you're bringing to class. Are you getting something from this, right? I mean, you could not even pass a class, but still get a key lesson and go and apply that in a workplace. And I think especially for quantitative instructors, it comes up a lot. Students sort of insecurity a little bit around, am I doing it right? Am I good enough for this class? And I think that your compassion as an instructor probably helps a lot of students bridge that gap for themselves to realize that they can get a lot from their education beyond what's going to come up in SpeakGrader, right at the very end of the session. So I appreciate you sharing that. So Zilong, same for you. Reflect on how long you've been teaching at Smith or in general, and then a challenge that you've had in the classroom, how you learned from it or overcame it, and a teaching win that you've had.
Thank you. So I joined Smith School in 2001. So it's my 20th year. Now before that, I taught somewhere else for 4 years. So it has been a while. But when I joined Smith School first, in the beginning, in fact, I started teaching in the MBA program right away, because at that time I was actually hired for teaching supply chain management. At that time, one of the core courses in our curriculum was the supply chain management. Later, it was replaced by operations management. So I have been teaching both courses. So the supply chain course first, and then switched to OM. And in the beginning, when I taught in the MBA program, I had a habit of kind of, teaching things quickly, because the materials I teach, even though it's quantitative, but to me, I'm sure, a lot of faculty have that experience. To us, it's so easy, right? So I have a tendency going over, the formulas, right? The analysis very quickly, right? I didn't realize in the beginning, okay? And then later, of course, after 1 or 2 times, then students kind of said, oh, you went through things too quickly, right? And I realized MBA students have very different backgrounds, right? Some, from humanity, history, English majors. Some, of course, they have, even mathematics major, right? Economics. So they have no problem, right? So I think that's one challenge, is that when you teach MBA students, particular, how to balance, right? Particularly for quantitative topics, how do you balance them, right? So you want to give enough level, right? So that most students will be happy with whatever the materials, right? You don't want to cover too many things, like too quickly, right? Even though that will benefit some top students in the class, but then, a lot of other students will complain. So that's kind of I learned in the beginning. Then I also slowed it down a little bit for example, by building in class exercises. So I have always been doing this now. So when I teach some topic, quantitative topic, right, a particular formula. So I will first say, do one example, show them on the board how I do it, right? Kind of, step by step. And then I say, okay, now next, it's your turn, right? So I give a similar problem and give them 5 minutes to work on the problem. Right? I obviously allow them to talk to, their neighboring students, and have a discussion with other students in the class, right? So I think that helps them understand the materials certainly much better, right? Because if they just watch me how I do it on the board, that's different from if they do it on their own, right? Obviously, it's very different, right? So now it becomes active learning. Okay, so so in every class, I usually, say every 45 minutes or so, I will have a problem for them to do, right? So now, of course, online, sometimes I assign them to a breakout room, right? Have a small team, they can discuss, and then, but of course, online it's a little more difficult to do, right? Particularly, because you don't know whether they are doing it or not. In a classroom setting, they have to do it, right? Because you are watching them, right? You walk around, you try to see what they are doing, and they have to do it. But now online, kind of, quiet, you don't know whether they are doing it or not. So I think using the breakout rooms is a great thing, right? Because now they have peer pressure, right? 2 or 3 students together, they have to do something. Okay, so I think that works out very well. So after that, I think a lot of students, came to me, say, oh, this actually really helped, right? So that way, when they do the homework, they already practiced in the class, right? Then of course the homework problems will be more difficult, but at least they are prepared, right? So that also, in fact, I use it now even with online. So I use a Surface. I'm using Microsoft Surface Book. So I use a Surface Pen, right? So I just treat my computer screen as the board. I kind of, show them how to do it. I just write on the screen and, show them how to work on a problem, and then give them time to do their own, right? So I think that works very well, right? So, I mean, in terms of Wing, and I think one of the things that, I'm kind of proud of myself is that I can explain things very clearly, right, for the quantitative topics. And now knowing that the students actually, they are also enjoying it, right? So they actually get a practice in the class. So this is something, I feel I feel great, right? And particularly I think for quantitative topics, right? Some things are very dry and still, they can enjoy, right? So that's I mean, one of the things I have been doing now. And also another thing I'm also started doing, I think, maybe a few years back, but right now I think is particularly important. I use a lot of online simulation games, right? So for every class I teach now, at least I have one simulation game, right? So even though, for the 7-week class, I actually do assign a simulation game. So for my OM class, for example, I have a simulation game which actually connects almost every topic in the class together. So in the end, they have to play the game. So that connects all the topics together, right? So I do give them time, right, to work on the game, because it's a very comprehensive game. So I assign, say, for example, starting from the 3rd week. So then in the remaining 4 weeks or so, every week, every class, I give them some time, right, to talk to, their teammates in the breakout rooms, right? And also, during office hours, they ask questions, and I have online quiz associated with this, right? So making sure everybody is contributing. And so it's a very, very big project, right? So, it's like 20-30% of the course grade. I think it helps the students, right? Particularly, I think right now, the interaction is really important. So that helps students, interact with each other, okay? And then some other courses, I have a smaller game, but still I have an online game, right, for them to play, so that, they get, at least they get some interactions. So and the feedback from my students is, they really enjoy these games. So yeah, so that's something I think, I will be actually keep doing this.
So thank you so much, Zhiming. I know when we talked about this, about your teaching, interaction is at the center of everything that you do. And I think sometimes when students think about quant courses, they think, oh, I'm just going to have to sit and listen. And I love that you focus on see it, do it, apply it, right? So they watch you do it, they work together, and then they get to go and apply it to the homework, all of the skills that you have taught them. I think it's wonderful that you try and strike that direct balance of interaction. And then there's one additional thing I wanted to highlight that you shared, that I know that we had discussed, which is you don't discount how much they can learn from each other, right? If you give them those few minutes to talk together, sometimes they can clarify something in a way that we would never think to do, or they'll give them sort of a quick example that brings it to life for them. And so everything that you've done, if you help one student, another student can then help another student, right? And it sort of creates
yeah exactly. I mean, particularly during this period now, right, student interaction is very important, right? Because otherwise, everybody sitting at home, they are kind of separated. So now, having these online games, having these projects, so they have to talk to each other, right? Assigning them to the breakout rooms. So kind of, they get some peer pressure as well as the peer learning as well. I think that's very important. Peer learning, I feel, is particularly important for quantitative courses, because, some of the things, if they do on themselves, it can take a much longer time, right, for them to pick up. But with their fellow students' help, I think they can learn things much more quickly, So that's something, the games, the breakout rooms, and doing the practice problems. I mean, if it's in a classroom setting, that all it's kind of having the help from other students. Right? These peer learning is really important.
So thank you all. If there's any questions from anybody who's here in attendance that you'd like to ask the panelists, please go ahead. Now is your moment.
I can ask a question.
Yeah, Chinay, go ahead.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much, all our panelists. I teach quantitative stuff for a long time, and I can say that I learned stuff in the last 45 minutes, 50 minutes from your experiences and the tips you have and stuff like that. I think there was a little bit of a touch to this, but then I think what would be really helpful to especially quantitative teachers in the business school and in MBA programs in general is one important thing, which is the distribution of the students, right? So that's one of the challenges that we always face, right? And again, some of you touched in parts of this, right? At one point, Zilong was saying, some have, math degrees, some have, right? But if all three of you could expand a little bit more, about how to manage the distribution, especially in a short time period, right? Like, for instance, many of us teach courses in 7 weeks, right? I mean, you have to kind of go through graduate material during that 7 weeks, right? Graduate quantitative material with some students, who might have already taken that course or that topic many times and with extensive quantitative backgrounds, sitting in the same session with some students who haven't touched math, in years, and they're coming from really, not very strong math backgrounds. So I think if you could all chime in on a little bit on how to manage the distribution like that, that would be really helpful.
I can jump in on that. I get the students pretty much on day one, since my course is term A, year one, and sometimes is a rude awakening for some. So I have two responses to that. So the first is in the classroom, and then the second is support outside the classroom. So in the classroom, so the math is the math. I think that's one of the advantages now of having some asynchronous content. So students have the ability to kind of review things at their own pace multiple times if they need to. But the other part in the classroom is having that rich contextual discussion about what these things mean and how they apply in the workplace or for businesses or for, economics, because then even the students who aren't getting the math can understand the conceptual picture, right? Which then eases that translation. And so there's something to kind of hang on to for everyone. And for those for whom the math is trivial, the contextual stuff can really stretch them, because the sky's the limit on how sophisticated you can get with those kinds of discussions. Outside the classroom, I work very hard to find a handful of TAs to provide a lot of support to the students. And I explicitly ask my TAs and, if whether they're hourly or graduate assistants, to, spend extra time with students who are struggling in a one-on-one context. And once that's kind of revealed, like who's struggling more with the material, whether because of the first quiz results or something, or they come and see me, I encourage them right away. I'm like, set up one-on-one time with the TAs now. And, get yourself in, and then we talk about the process of how to move through the material in a very methodical way. How to learn the math concepts. And then I provide a whole background from Khan Academy, on mastering the underlying algebra, et cetera, and pre-calc or calc that they need for class. So the combination of kind of the tools and then the varied levels of discussion in the classroom is how I manage the distribution.
I share what Rachel and Zilong basically have been saying. what I learned when I switched from a master's in finance in Europe to the MBA here was precisely like handling the distribution and understanding what's the background of students, what's the average student. And what I basically ended up doing is what Silon was mentioning, which is putting much more examples. I think I'm good in actually explaining like the essence of what things are. So for instance, like, they've seen the Black-Scholes formula before, but they think they look at it with a lot of respect, right? Like they don't understand. And so then I basically start saying, what does this mean? What does this mean? Like for them to have an intuition of where things come from. And I mean, I'm not sure, but I think these type of things work. I also, what I was doing before that, I think with videos now it's even easier, is to put material for all audiences. So once you understand who is your average student, there's someone that's going to wants to dig further. So I put things on Canvas for whomever wants to actually dig further on that. And then I always put, make sure that, when I'm teaching something, I kind of ask questions deliberately to understand what is the first thing that they answer me about, like some key concept that they should know from previous courses. And when I understand that this is something that is not clear, like I go back to this, I'll tell them like where to go into that. It's not something that I'm going to cover, but I understand that if they don't get it, I'm not going to be successful. So I try to cover the layers by putting also additional material for them to check on their own. And yes, indeed, what Rachel was saying, like being available, either through your TA or whatever, like off hours, so that they can feel that they can ask you questions. Like, I think that's important, right? That they feel that you're not this sort of like nasty person that is going to single them out if they ask something silly. I mean, and that helps because even in class, if everyone starts asking, which I encourage them to do, I also understand what's my average student and where are the gaps. So that's essentially what you are saying has been basically my learning experience itself at the MBA program.
Yeah, so I think Rachel and Cecilia have covered, I think, the things that I do also. So for, similar things, right? I do, so for the mathematical formulas, right? So I try to kind of tell students, don't be scared by the formulas, right? So you need to look at the intuition behind them, right? So give them the intuition. And, I try to tell them the intuition is really straightforward, right? Why, X divided by Y. What is X? What is Y? What is the ratio of this, right? So I tell them, you don't need to memorize the formula, right? Try to see what is the intuition. Once you know the intuition, then naturally you will have the formula, right? So I try to tell them mathematical formulas is not the purpose of this course, right? The purpose is how do you use them? How do you have the intuition? Eventually, we will be solving problems. It's not just the formulas, right? So I think that can ease some students' mind a little bit because some students, when they see the formula, they're scared in the beginning, right? And so that's one thing I do, and also something else, as the two. Rachel and Cecilia already mentioned that, you obviously you spend time with them, right? You give, provide office hours. You try to make sure, they understand the things, right? You don't wait too long, right? If, you just wait. So you in the beginning, after say 1 or 2 homework assignments, you pretty much figure out, who is doing really very well. You can notice some students in the bottom, right? They're struggling with the quantitative stuff. Then you try to help them, right? And I also try to develop some additional slides, some basic things, give them a review, right? Other students, they don't need to review. So I said, if you have problems with this basic mathematics, go review my slides, right? So I provided something else. So that way I think helps them a little bit also.
Chinai, thank you for that question. It is 12:56, so I just want to close it out now. I know we're lucky to have you. Thank you for being in this panel. We'll send out some resources to you afterwards, and then as soon as this is recorded, we'll share it with you all so that you can disseminate it with anyone and everybody that you would like to see it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Take care, all.
Okay, thank you. Nice to see you all.
Same. Bye.
So,
Bye.
Bye,
Take care.
everyone.
Have a good weekend.
Okay.